Good afternoon, everyone. The end of the day. Long time. My slides. First thing I did was select the background. It's purple. You know what that means? It's a combination of red and blue. And if you're an American, you know what it means to be red. That's MAGA, that's Mr. Trump. And blue is the democratic liberal order. All right, so you combine them together. Now the other thing, if you look closely at the background here, you see these circles. They're randomly placed. They're of different sizes. Well, I'm going to talk about physics today. Particle physics, about which I know virtually nothing, but it's connected with dialogue, as I'll show you in a moment. I have a big topic here, a big topic: peace-building dialogue, reconciliation, interfaith discussion, intractable conflict, and then I threw in AI, because this is the era of AI contributions. This one? So, I'm going to get with the claim about dialogue. I've heard it all day, and it's the following. We all know that dialogue is serious, honest, verbal communications between people. Its purpose, I've listed 4 arguments here: to build mutual understanding and tolerance, to close gaps of social and political polarization, to enhance feelings of inspirational and invigorating group vibrancy, and to encourage smooth relations in today's interconnected world in which there's a lot of fragmentation. How about evaluating the claim? Now here is my research, mainly from last summer, where I was looking for documented evidence of these 4 claims. It's a mix, to be honest. But a peace-building consensus, and I've heard it all day here at this conference, believes that dialogue through either formal third-party mediation for political conflict resolution and informal grassroots movements for interfaith gatherings are important, supportive elements in building attitudes of peaceful coexistence. But as others who have tried to evaluate the claim have said, this is hard to gauge. It's based on the following premises. It's the way I analyze it. First is that you can move from a state of hostility to a state of harmony through dialogue. Dialogue is the conduit, it's the mechanism. Reconciliation dialogue between former adversaries is grounded in the participation hypothesis made very famous by Habermas, that people engaged in discussion with the other to create consensus become committed to a shared outcome for the common good. Interfaith dialogue has a different premise, which is that it's grounded in the contact hypothesis, one of the most famous hypotheses in American sociology dealing with integration between blacks and whites, published first in the 1950s. It's known as the contact hypothesis, that people meeting the other to share stories and interests to reduce misperceptions can find mutual understanding, common ground. So in other words, dialogue has a two-form purpose: common good and common ground. So what I want to speak about here this afternoon is a few more comments about dialogue foundations. First of all, the contemporary dialogue paradigm. That's where physics comes in. Secondly, the specific objectives of a dialogue. I count 6. And third, the philosophical assumptions necessary to make peace-building dialogue work. Then a few words about its application within reconciliation. I'll talk about, just very briefly, requirements for successful outcomes. Interfaith dialogue, I'm going to talk about 2 parts of the Abrahamic religion: Islam-Christian relations and Christian-Jewish relations. And then thirdly, intractable conflict. I just selected one that seems pretty common in this genre: the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. And then I'll close by talking about some prospects about AI, artificial intelligence, and augmented intelligence tools. So the contemporary dialogue paradigm was created by a quantum theoretic physicist. Most of you probably know this. His name, David Bohm. And he starts out talking about how matter and particles operate in the universe, and wrote an article in the end of the 80s, I think maybe 1990, about how mind operates in the same way. He had this theory that there's an implicate order that you can't see, and that implicate order leads to the explicate order, which is observable. So in physics, the implicate order is the particle behavior of matter. In the social life, the implicate order is beliefs, thoughts, and prejudices of the human mind. Those are things that create the explicate order. The implicate order, however, is fluid. It's changing. People can have very negative attitudes, and they can be revised to become less animus towards others. It enfolds into the explicate order, which, as I said, is observable. And in order to bring about social change, you have to change the explicate order. But to do that, you have to change the implicate order, and that's dialogue. Dialogue is a method for changing the implicate order by collective thinking, for collective learning, for collective action, for social change. 4 pieces. If you want to change the world, it starts with what's inside the head, and you've got to have expression about this in a safe environment. That's the collective thinking, collective learning, collective action for social change. So the functions of a dialogue, according to Bohm and his associates, were to explore the roots of human crisis, the fragmentation, to observe people's hidden values and intentions, to recognize the puzzles of incoherence in mind, to see how feelings, emotions, thoughts, and desires function, and to allow collective learning and expanded harmony in social life. He made applications of this notion of his dialogue. He was very excited about it. In Ojai, California, he ran seminars from the mid-'80s until he died in 1992. It was picked up at MIT by the Sloan Management School in their dialogue project that operated from the early 90s and continues to this day in corporate business, in service sectors like hospitals and community forums. It's very well known. I've listed some of Bohm's books here that were all published posthumously based on his lectures. Thought as a System, On Dialogue, The Limits of Thought, Wholeness and the Implicit Order, and a couple of MIT books that are wide sellers, The Fifth Dimension and Dialogue of the Art of Thinking Together. So, turning now to the specifics of a dialogue, I take this from a logician, a communication theory logician, mathematics. He was kind of a Renaissance guy. Okay, Doug Walton is his name, and he evaluated different formats for considering what constitutes a dialogue. I've kind of briefed his assessment here because he said we joined everything together saying dialogue, and we know what it means. No, he said there are very specific things. They can range from information seeking, where you have groups of people coming together. They have knowledge, but they seek more information, and the dialogue ends then when they have a satisfactory exchange. That's one of the functions of, I think, the Hizmet dialogue processes. Then he talks about inquiry dialogue, where you need proof of a situation that it actually exists. You can just read it here. And when that proof is satisfied, you've finished the dialogue. Discovery, you need a more detailed explanation of a situation. And then we have persuasion, which is the more common form in which it's used, and deliberation, and at last negotiation. We often think of dialogue at the bottom of the list here. You know, people are getting together in order to make an action agreement that satisfies both sides. But it has many other purposes. And this is very important, as he says, because there's a danger when dialogues don't work. And many times they don't work in many situations. If you shift, if you come in to a setup thinking this is going to be a discovery dialogue, and suddenly one party said, no, we're going to negotiate, make a deal here. Okay, there's a danger in doing that because you haven't finished out the purpose of the original reason for coming together. So that's my example. A party may decide to move from persuasion to negotiation, but this blocks the road to agreement, actually. So the recommendation is you have to monitor the flow and stay in the lane, so to speak, so you don't move ahead too quickly. The tendency for people who are in a former hostility situation, they want to move quickly. Well, this is a slow process. It's hard to do that. Finish the objective before moving ahead. The other thing I'll mention here is the format on dialogue phrases developed by Jay Rothman back in the 90s. He calls it the aria method. Those of you in music know what this means. And his notion is a dialogue should begin between parties who are in some kind of opposition, and they should have an antagonistic phrase where they can argue, they can fight. They don't have to be calm and peaceful. They have to be honest, stay straightforward. This is why I hate you. And this is why you may hate me, and we get that out on the table, then we clean that up. Now, sometimes he says dialogues end right there because everybody leaves angry. But if they're okay going to phase 2, it's resonance. I'll be in your shoes, you be in my shoes. He's done this with Palestinians and Israelis. You know, he tells a Palestinian, he tells an Israeli, could pretend you're a Palestinian, he tells it to the other side. At the end of one of the dialogues, as I know Jay Rothman, you know, the Palestinian said to the Israeli, you make my case better than I do. Okay, that's the resonance part. Well, if you can finish that, then you can move into invention and action. Because one of the criticisms of dialogue is they never move to those last steps. They're thinking social change, collective thinking, collective learning, collective action, social change, but they don't always end there. So he thinks that's an important part of ending it. Okay, let me move on to another part of my sort of agenda building here is the philosophical assumptions about dialogue for peace. This is, I think, very critical. There are two different assumptions about whether you can allow or make possible the seemingly impossible of cooperation between different groups. It's known as the value commensurability or the value incommensurability issue. Plato developed the utilitarian method of valuation. Everything is fungible, it's quantifiable, it's transferable on a universal scale. Monies, utilities, goods. That's the conflict resolution mantra. We believe it very strongly, all of us who are in the peace business. We think negotiation and dialogue for peace is possible. We don't challenge it. But there's another side, the value incommensurability position. And that's Levinas, who is a French-Lithuanian continental philosopher of recent times. And he said, no, personal beliefs about what is meaningful and important can't be reduced to a measurable exchange to approximate equal value. Sounds like the Palestinian, Israeli problem here. You can't do that in all circumstances, he argues, that some black and white will simply remain that keep parties apart. These are the intractable conflict issues. And Levinas says, in this case, you'll have interminable negotiations. They'll be small and tiny. They will never solve the basic issue of value. So there's two things we need to recognize in the dialogue for peace, that not everybody in every case thinks about the way of commensurability. Some think it's not possible. Okay, so let me move now into the three different formats of talking about how dialogue could apply. And on this slide, I simply show you in post-war reconciliation dialogues, which only became popular in the post-Cold War period, only since 1990s or thereabouts. The success factors, if they work, like sort of worked in Bosnia, sort of worked in Cambodia. I mean, these are like always sort of worked, but they're moving upward. First of all, the absence of a radical disagreement between disputants. The value incommensurability problem doesn't really exist. It's more of the utilitarian model that works. Secondly, the appropriate engagements for dialogue participants. These are things that people need training to do because we're not naturally born this way, sad to say. And there's these 4 points that is mentioned in the Bohm dialogue and so forth. Speaking with others with authentic voice. You have to be not only honest, you have to be vulnerable. You have to open up yourself. You have to listen to others for the deep understanding, and you can only do that if you're vulnerable yourself. You have to respect others with dignity and suspend personal assumptions. No judgment. A collective thinking process will lead to consensus solutions if everybody is participating with this orientation. And then the collective learning, as I've said it, already can lead to action, and that can lead to social change. It's very slow. You need a big support structure to do this. Example is the Nansen centers in Bosnia that the Norwegians sent up. Back in 1995, and they had them all over about 6 areas in the country so that anybody, children on up through seniors, could come in to say, I've got a little issue, can we solve this? So they were like constantly functioning. It's still in existence. I have no closing time here, but it's piece by piece by piece, and that's a very important piece to remember in this process. And of course, it was very costly to have these centers and to have people there as support structures all the time. Okay, now let me turn to the interfaith dialogue in particular. Some of you may know this very famous statement by the Swiss Catholic theologian Hans Kuhn. I'm sorry I forgot the umlaut over the U there, that he said in 1986. No peace among the nations without peace among the religions. No peace among the religions without dialogue between the religions. No dialogue between the religions without investigation of foundations of the religions. 2 dialogue formats have been presented for evaluation, but I'm only going to talk about a more current one today, which only came out about 5 years ago by a guy named Melnick. He said, when you're going to look at interfaith dialogue, you have 4 different criteria. What is the intention? With respect to intention, he said, we have to look at, are you wondering who is right? That's, a superiority or inferiority orientation. Who are you? That's cognitive learning. How can we live together? The peace plans. How can we improve the world together? 4 different kinds of intentions. Goals, he said, in an interfaith dialogue, what does the group want to achieve? What are the principles? And then who are the participants? Are they mainly spiritual leaders? Are they interested citizens? So this format, I've decided to look at 2 of the binaries, the Islam Christian and then the Christian Jewish. Now, a book I read recently said the disaster of war is what leads to interfaith initiatives. So taking that literally, I decided, okay, how does that apply in these 2 cases? Well, as you know, the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, then a civil war and the creation of the Republic of Turkey, a secular regime for nationalism and modernity. There was a ban on Islamic practices. Call to prayer was abandoned. No traditional dress. No more religious education. A lot of the Islamic scholars left. They left the area. Turkey was seen as a lost cause. Rise of Said Nusri, who some of you mentioned, who brought a new philosophy, which is that religion and science combined. It's not either or, it's not choose one. It's combine them, coexistence. His follower, as we have noted, is Fethullah Gulen, who was a Nursi. He wrote a collection called The Advocate of Dialogue, and this constructed the basis of the dialogues around the world, that science and religion coexist. it became very popular in America in post 9/11, where Americans were very concerned with, why did all these Muslims decided to attack the U.S.? The Muslims everybody was grouped together. There was no difference about them, but here were the Gulen societies that were ready and willing and very eager to, work with them, and I think that contribute to, a big part of the success. Okay, so what, if I just have to summarize the 4 points here, okay. The intention of these dialogues are to avoid polemical exchange of superiority, become acquainted with the other, cognitive understanding, seek peaceful coexistence, and know theological debate on doctrinal differences. Now, they're important. In Christianity, Jesus is the Son of God. And in Islam, he's a prophet. That's a huge, huge difference. But the orientation is avoid all of this. Principles for Muslim seeking ethical life and righteous, pious behavior. The personal peace orientation. If everybody applied personal peace, we'd have world peace. For Christians, it's quite different. They want a division between religion and politics because they think these norms should be separate. So they're interested also in country peace, and they're concerned about some Islamic states that use those principles to run their politics. The goals build a spiritual sense of unity and friendship, and the form is public gatherings of interested, committed citizens in a grassroots effort. Let me turn to this one, which was very different, the Christian-Jewish. Again, the disaster of war leads to interfaith initiative. Defeat of the Nazis in World War II and the recognition of the Holocaust, 6 million European Jews were killed by the regime that was acknowledgement of the Christian doctrine of deicide, i.e. God-killing and Jewish youth. There's, in the New Testament, in the Christian Bible, Matthew 27:25, which states the following: "Let his blood be on us and on our children." That's after Jesus was first claimed the King of the Jews. Then the supporters went fickle and they said, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pontius Pilate said no, and that's when the people said, "Let his blood be on us." That then was incorporated. This, I had no idea. I was just stunned by this. And I have a Christian background, but it's Protestant. This was Catholic theology. There was this led rise to anti-Semitism, that the Jews committed deicide. They killed God, and they had to carry that guilt forever. That's Matthew 27:25. So these two, anti-Semitism was fueled into Nazi fascism. 1946, there was the first meeting of International Council of Christians and Jews. It was mainly Protestant and Jewish theologians. 1947, the declaration was issued by this group. Jews should not be regarded as enemies of Christianity. Deicide and Jewish guilt doctrine should be abolished. 1947, 2 years after the Holocaust, that was stated because anti-Semitism was continuing. It wasn't until 1965, the Roman Catholic Church Vatican Council II issued Nostra Aetate, Latin, which means in our time. Deicide and Jewish guilt doctrine should be abolished. Interfaith dialogue should be encouraged. That's when the Catholics set up the interfaith format that they had, which is different when I presented. But it wasn't until Y2K, year 2000, the Jewish responded to this with Dabru Emet, which means speak truth, which is Jews and Christian worship the same God, accept the same moral principles. Parties should work together for peace and justice. So the intention in this dialogue is to determine who was right. The Christians always felt they were superior. And historically, they did this. They discriminated heavily. And after World War II, then the center was to eliminate anti-Semitism and build peaceful coexistence. So here, the goals have been joint projects, quite a few of them, such as the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. Principles are: Christians sought forgiveness for repressing Jewish people. Jews have sought non-discrimination. The form is very often meeting of spiritual leaders. That's the more common format, which in the other one is more of a grassroots-oriented, process. Okay, so assessment here. Right, 90 seconds, all right. Assessment of interfaith dialogue. In the 21st century, you have an expansion, Christian, Islam, Jewish dialogues, 3 Abrahamic faiths, Gulen societies around the world. There are other centers in Baltimore, Maryland, in Doha, Qatar, in Vienna, and in Israel. In fact, Israel is saturated with all these dialogues, but they seem to make very little difference when it comes to conflict. A couple of scholars here, one article states that proponents rely on untested assumptions, ungrounded ideas of how their efforts will bring social change. These groups need to go beyond social cohesion. They need to make plans for social change. A rabbi said, you know, I've been active in interfaith dialogue for 30 years. We always say we affirm mutual understanding, tolerance, and dialogue. It's an empty phrase. But he said sometimes somebody gets excited about their faith and why their faith is different, and that's the exciting part of it. A recent evaluation of dialogues between Christians and Muslims in Jordan, and they made a really big effort here. It produced 0 attitude change. No Muslims changed attitude, no Christians changed attitude. But people who normally didn't meet, met, but that's all that happened. An article in 2025 said, maybe we should forget about social change and interfaith dialogue and just focus on religious responsibility, spiritual solidarity, not social change. Okay. I don't have time to talk about the intractable conflict and dialogue. I'm going to have to forego that. I'm happy to send you my slides or a copy of my paper and how everybody got involved in this attitude, so I'm going through here very quickly. Dialogue fails when you don't have commitment among leadership on both sides to get a change. And when you violate dialogue rules, people bluff, they lie, they don't speak with authentic voice. When the dialogue objective shifts from persuasion to negotiation, parties aren't ready, and when you have value incrementability, it's not going to work at any time in any case. And I have closing statements about AI, and the last thing I'm going to say about is that, you know, dialogue for peace is about attitude change. It's about a shift in human feelings, moving from conflict into cooperation and harmony. Machines can help find, you know, disputants' attitudes, policy positions. They can generate proposals. But this depends on the AI source library, which in our field is very, very weak. Everything we want, it's virtually not there. These are some documents for how you would get that, and we don't have most of this stuff in machine-readable form. We're so limited. So I get upset when I hear hype, hype, hype about AI because it is not the resolution. I ask them, you know, how would you solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem? Guess what? It's what I already knew. It's got value incommensurability. We can't do anything about it. So I have a wish list, and my final statement here. Peace-building dialogue is difficult, it's slow, it's prone to fail. It's very useful for confronting religion in post-war crisis environments. It's not effective for social change. We still have attitudes and the persistence of, you know, these negativities. It's very good for social cohesion, and I admire all the things that the Hizmet movement is doing. Last, you can see artificial intelligence is oversold. It's based on potential. There's very little that we can get out of it right now. The augmented intelligence was just have computers constructing theoretic formulas that we can look at, and that's wise.